Alrighty, so this video is about the ethmoid bone, which you can see here. And it's a weird little bone that sits right behind your forehead. So it's right behind the frontal bone in the middle. And it is kind of a weird cube that has some special features or functions. So just to orient you, this is the front, so the anterior aspect, and this is the posterior aspect. So this little guy, the crista galli, which means crest of the rooster, the crista galli is in the front part. So if you're trying to figure out how this sits in your face, you can use the crista galli as an indicator. So that's the front. So that means that this surface that we're looking at here faces laterally, and it happens to face laterally into the orbit. So it makes up part of the wall of the eye socket. So we call this surface the orbital plate or orbital surface. And there's one on each side. So if I were to rotate this around, and I will in a second, you would see the other orbital plate or surface. And in fact, why don't I do that? So here you can see the orbital plate or surface on the other side. Okay, so now we're going to look at the top view. So we're going to look down into the skull and see the top part of the ethmoid bone. So again, here's the crista galli as viewed from the top. And then you'll see that this section here, which is called the cribriform plate, I'm going to write it out for you, but it's going to be in red because it's not on your list. But the reason I'm telling you about it is because it's the surface in which the olfactory foramina, which are on your list, so all these little holes, so the olfactory foramina are in the cribriform plate. So these provide passage for olfactory nerves. So this is one of the bony evidences for how you smell things. So speaking of olfactory nerves and the nasal cavity, there's another important piece of the ethmoid bone that relates to the nasal cavity. And so I'm going to rotate this so we can look at that. There we go. Okay, so we have the front again. So we're looking at the anterior aspect. And what you'll be able to see is this bony projection is the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone. And this forms 1/2 of the nasal septum. So the nasal septum is the dividing wall that divides your nasal cavity into 2 halves. So the top half of the nasal septum is the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone. So now I'm going to do the thing I did in the maxilla video where I drew in another bone to give you some context because it can be helpful to add stuff in. So the other half of the nasal septum is made up of a bone called the vomer. And the vomer is, it's hard to understand. It's kind of knife-shaped. It looks weird. So let's get into it. So if I were to draw in the vomer, you would see it looks kind of like this. And then the rest of the nasal cavity would be made up by the maxilla on the sides. And let's make them orange, I guess. The nasal bones at the top. So your nasal cavity is walled in on the sides and on the top by the maxilla and the nasal bones, and then it's divided in half at the top by the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone, and on the bottom by the vomer. So now let me turn this to the side and kind of draw how it looks from the side, just so you can get a better idea of what the vomer actually looks like. Because again, it's hard to conceptualize. Okay, and I'm actually going to tilt this a little bit just so we can see. So this is the perpendicular plate. And so the vomer is kind of, oops, I want it to be blue again, just for consistency's sake. The vomer is kind of shaped like a knife almost, and it just makes up the rest of the nasal septum. So one of the skulls that we have in the lab has what's called a deviated septum, which is where the septum leans to one side or the other. And in the case of that particular one, the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone is more or less straight, but the vomer is waggling off to one side. So I will draw what that looks like. But it's pretty cool that we have a skull like that in the lab with such an obvious deviated septum. So let's draw that in. So our skull in the lab looks like this, where the perpendicular plate is pretty straight, and then the vomer is like, woo, way deformed. So what that would mean would be that this side of the nasal cavity is occluded. I can't remember whether occluded has two C's or one. I'm just going to write it out and we'll see how it looks. It's two C's. Sometimes you just have to write it out and see what it looks like. So that would mean that they had a really hard time breathing out of that side of their nose in life. So you can get surgery to correct this, where they basically break the inside of your nose and then reset it, and then pack the inside of your nose with gauze until it heals. Unpleasant, but worth the benefit of breathing. But regardless, the deviated septum correction surgery has nothing to do with the cosmetic appearance of your nose on the outside. That's all about your frontal bone and your cartilages. Deviated septum is on the inside. So if anybody ever tries to tell you that they got a nose job because they have a deviated septum, they're a little bit full of it. They're just trying to justify a cosmetic surgery, which is perfectly acceptable to just have because you want one. Not a big deal. All right, so that was the ethmoid bone, and I will see you in the next video.